My name's David Helvarg. I'm moderating. I'm the Executive Director of Blue Frontier Ocean Conservation Group and an author of a number of books, including The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea, which, when it first came out in hardcover in 2013, I was writing about some beautiful and abundant kelp forests along the California coast. So I'm going to introduce you the last, first of all, we're in another disaster. The last few years I've been covering California's wildfires for National Geographic, other folks, and deservedly it's gotten huge attention that our forests have been impacted by a cascading series of disasters, with climate change being a major contributor. And it's gotten worldwide attention, but California also has another forest system, our marine forest, our kelp forest, that have also been decimated in the same period. We've seen the rise of wildfires on land. We've seen the decline of kelp forest. And yet very few people, even very few Californians, are aware of the scale of the disaster that's taking place just off our shores. And to a large degree, a result of forces beyond California's ability to manage. The former cascading disasters, since 2014, there was a marine heat wave that you'll hear about, and in combination with a sea star wasting disease that was also supercharged by warmer water. So two disasters that had huge impact that are both climate linked. And we have the expertise to explain all that, and also the efforts to do something to deal with the crisis, restoration efforts. And our three speakers, our three panelists, I'll introduce briefly. They'll each speak for a bit, and then we'll have a discussion, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for any of your questions. So first we'll be speaking is Francesca Coe, Program Chair and Director of the Greater Farallones Association. She's a member of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council, the editor of deeperblue.com, and Chief Media Officer for Vertical Blue, which if you're a free diver, you know it's one of the top free diving competitions in the world. And we have Dr. Kristen Elsmore as a Senior Environmental Scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Marine Program. And she's been working primarily on kelp restoration and management. Her collaborative efforts have included building partnerships among academics, industries, government agencies, conservation groups, and commercial fishermen. So folks who are always challenged to get along. And Denise McDonald is in charge of global brand marketing for Urchinomics, a company looking to create urchin ranches to convert zombie urchin barrens, where kelp forest once thrived, into a tasty source of uni and other edible urchin products for restaurants and other outlets, while helping restore our kelp habitat. So first, just to start on what kelp is and where it's gone, Francesca.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Francesca Coe, and I am always happy to talk about kelp. Giant kelp, bull kelp, Nereocystis, Macrocystis, all the kelp. Anna, if we can cue the slides. Sure. I'll have a loop. These will be background visuals for you to enjoy. So, as David was mentioning, the kelp forests here in California, especially in Northern California, are unparalleled. And they are building blocks for so many species. Food, forage, shelter for invertebrates, for fish, for whales, for marine mammals, and even for humans. Sadly, in the past decade or so, we've seen a decline and a disappearance of up to 95% of our former abundant kelp canopy. And that really is a complete degradation of the forest. So how did we get here? Well, we had an unfortunate series of events. We had the sea star wasting disease, we had the blob, we had marine heat waves, and on and on and on. And in any catastrophe, it's never one thing that creates the problem. It's usually a dozen things. So all of these things happened consecutively on top of one another. And in the process, this marine ecosystem, which was normally balanced out by a main predator, for the purple urchin, Pycnopodia, otherwise known as the giant sunflower sea star, was basically wiped out. And then you had these warm temperatures, these marine heat waves. And so the normally nutrient-dense, rich with food for the kelp, cold water upwelling was deficient. And so you had starving kelp, and then you had kelp that was completely overgrazed by these purple urchin who had no one to check them. And so they started to outpace the red urchin, the abalone. So 85% of what was once a very viable commercial fishery, the red urchin, which is uni if you enjoy sushi, and the abalone had nothing to eat and nothing to cling to. So fast forward to end of 2017, beginning of 2018. And the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary Association and the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife said, okay, we need to get together, partner up, let's figure out what's going on here. And so we created a work group. And I co-chaired this kelp recovery work group with a scientist named Cynthia Catton. And Cynthia is now doing this work up in the state of Washington because, unfortunately, it's not limited to our California coast. It's happening up and down the western sea line and in other places around the world. We have the good fortune of now having Kristen Elsmore head up and direct the kelp work at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'll let her talk about that. But this is all to say that it takes so many hands and so many perspectives and so many different approaches. The reason this kelp recovery work group was so important is because we looked at not just the whys and the wheres of scientifically where this degradation was happening, but we also knew we needed to include the who's. Who's equipped to give us the best information? Who can secure these strategies so we see the best outcomes? Who needs to be present and at the table, which is basically everyone. So we had partnership and collaboration with the tribes, with divers, with fisher people, with students, with academics, scientists, nonprofits, resource managers, businesses, new innovations, residents. Everyone came together and we created a report that gave priority to what we thought would be the most effective strategies to address fostering resilience and understanding where persistence was so that we could benefit those locations to help potentially outplant more kelp. So this is a long-winded way of saying there were many efforts. The good news is that all of those strategies that we identified with the help of so many people are being implemented and executed right now. And so from this enormous outpouring of instantaneous energy from the community, we created these urchin removal events, and they were all volunteers. And so all those commercial urchin fishermen who were sadly out of work, and all of the ab divers who couldn't harvest ab because the fishery was closed, came to our events, and that was all volunteered, and that was all instigated by individuals. Well, I'm happy to share with you that that nascent work, which again begins with just one person, has now turned into an actual official, large-scale, targeted urchin removal funded by the California Resources Agency through the OPC, the Ocean Protection Council, where they're taking those commercial guys and they're looking at these specific coves up in the North Coast, and they are funding it to the tune of $500,000. Which I know it might not sound like a lot, but it definitely, when you're starting from volunteer to actually raising state funds, it's phenomenal. Coupled in that effort, Reef Check was doing monitoring and surveying, and they are still doing that. And out of this work plan, out of this collaboration, Reef Check is doing a lot of things. They've got these projects down at Tankers Reef, at Lovers Point, and today, in fact, there's a class. If you're a scuba diver, you can take a course called Kelp Restoration, and they will teach you where and how to safely remove urchin in the right places, in the appropriate places. And so all of this coming to production is just fantastic work. I also want to mention the Kashaya Coastal Reserve. So we had traditional ecological knowledge all the way through, which made us understand, let's not think of the urchin as just the problem. They're actually part of this system. They're organic material. How can we be looking at it? So the Kashaya Coastal Reserve has been piloting aerial remote operated drones so that we can look at the kelp canopy and we can understand where we're seeing more, where we're seeing less, what are we looking at. As a part of that effort, UCLA funded 3 years worth of mapping and data analysis, which was really important because up until a point, we were getting these airplane aerial surveys from the department, and then, budgets don't allow for these things. Sometimes they're expensive. And using drones, they're much more flexible, it's much more nimble, and we can actually engage more people. So the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass on to my colleagues, is that for over 3 years, I have been nudging and calling and advocating and lobbying to Representative Jared Huffman, our North Coast District 2, but also to the new Representative Padilla, who is more Central Coast, that we need actual federal funding. Local is great, state is great, but we need federal funding for this issue. And I'm happy to announce that 10 days ago, in that federal omnibus budget, we were given an earmark of $2 million to now scale and amplify all of this great work that's happening. It's a drop in a bucket. It's not enough, but it gives me hope that someday I'm going to be able to go ab diving again, and that other legislative vehicles will come into play to magnify the work that has begun.
Thank you, Francesca. It's very exciting, big news. And you summarized kind of the history of where we've been and how we got to where we are now very well, so thank you. I'll add in a couple little details to supplement that in just a second, but I do want to thank you very much for that intro. To also add that we have, as the state, back up, I'm Kristen Elsmore, and I work for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and working on kelp and kelp management and restoration, and this is something really exciting that the state is engaging in. As Francesca outlined, the timeline of where we were before, like the state is now engaging in developing a kelp restoration and management plan. This is going to be a statewide plan, which I think is really big and it's really exciting, and we're in the really early developmental stages of this plan. But as Francesca highlighted, how critical it is to have this stakeholder engagement, to engage with all of the people in the communities up and down the coast that are experiencing the consequences of kelp loss firsthand. And so it's just gonna take a moment to just say that it's really exciting that we're here, and please reach out when you guys have questions as we go through this early stages of this process. And we appreciate having engagement throughout the whole development of the plan. Francesca also highlighted some really great steps that have been taken that are leading up and getting built into this plan. So all of these restoration efforts, these pilot projects, the project in the North Coast in Mendocino that is engaging with commercial fishermen, a little bit of detail on that, how this project is unfolding is it's a partnership with Reef Check, with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, with the Ocean Protection Council, with the commercial fishermen, with educational organizations, the Noyo Center for Marine Science, based in Fort Bragg. And we're all working together, in the Watermen's Alliance, of course, too, sorry. And we're all working together to conduct restoration and figure out how best to navigate that in Fort Bragg. And that's pretty amazing. So I will just hand off the mic. Actually, I'm talking too much. I'll hand it off to Denise to plug in where Urchinomics is fitting into all this.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for allowing me to come today. You did such a good job on describing where we are and how we got here that I won't repeat that at all. But Urchinomics, what we do is we take these zombie barren urchins from the ocean floor. We take them into our land-based systems on land, feed them for about 6 to 12 weeks with formulated feed to build up their roe, and then sell them onwards to restaurants. So we're working with nonprofit partners to secure divers that are responsible for restoration efforts so that we can be sure that we're a part of the restoration efforts as opposed to just picking urchins here and there. And then they get a proceeds of our revenues that go back into the restoration effort. So it's a circular effort. Where we are today in California in particular, we have secured a site. We do have a site, which is really exciting because we started pre-pandemic. We started at the Bodega Marine Lab. We had some funding from the Nature Conservancy to test our technology on the purples. And that was pre-pandemic. That was a year before the pandemic happened. And it was a success. We spent a year doing it, and we had great results, and that gave us a promise that this is a doable and a commercialized opportunity in California. We also work with San Diego State University with Renee Angwin there for the last, I would say, 5 years now, in also testing various protocols and technologies to get this commercialized and up and running. So where we are today is we have this site in the Port of Hueneme, and we are operational at the moment. And we are super excited to have a site in California along the coastline because with regulations and there's just not very many permitted sites along the California coastline for us to get our sites up and running. We hopefully by the end of this year will have urchins that are sellable. Currently they're in spawning season, and so we are working on different strategies to get them to not spawn, and that is our goal. So we're hoping by the end of this year that we actually have product that we're able to sell and test market. But we are just very excited to have somewhere to call home here because this is ground zero of this issue for us in North America at the moment.
For those of you who don't know, you were referring to roe and spawning. The urchins that she's talking about, when you have an urchin barren or when we're talking about kelp loss, there are what that looks like. And then do you have it? I can't remember if you put any images of a barren in here, but it's just the sea floor caked with spiky purple blobs. And when they're really healthy and happy and in a healthy kelp forest, they go through these seasonal cycles of reproducing. And what people usually consume is that reproductive material, which is their gonad material, or also referred to as roe. And so they get kind of fattened up, and they have a seasonal cycle. So you're referring to in the lab or in your facilities, altering that so that you can maybe consume them year-round.
Yes, thank you. And also something that is important to mention is that the urchins are not consumable when they're living in the barrens. They live in the barrens for decades to centuries in starvation mode, and there's no roe in them. So when I talk about like a barren urchin that we collect, it's just been sitting there. They can't be fished, so there's no economic value to them. And predatory species somehow know that they're not edible. So they just sit there and live and are of no value, and they still are able to reproduce. So they just grow and multiply, and they're like lawnmowers in the kelp forest. There's some fantastic visuals online, and I'm sure everybody here has seen them, but it's just like a blanket of purple urchins and then a line where there's kelp, and they're just kind of like mowing down the kelp. So, oftentimes divers will when they collect the red urchins, they will go along that kelp line, and that's where they tend to collect urchins that are edible. But the purples in the barrens are not edible and have no economic value.
Okay, and if we'll just come in with the Urchinomic video when we can.
Okay.
Before I get into any hard questions, I'm just I'm a diver. I will sign up. I love diving in warm water. I don't get comfortable in cold water, but I'm willing to, there are like two amazing places to dive, basically, on tropical coral reefs, which is warm water, and I'll like put on 7-ply wetsuit and 7 mil and a hoodie and boots and all to go into the other amazing habitat, which is our kelp forest right here in California. And just it's like underwater Sherwood Forest, with when the light's filtering down. I've freed, leopard shark from a lobster trap. Now we're not supposed to approach marine mammals within 50 feet, but they don't know that. So I've had, harbor seals come up in my face and others, sea lions passing like 800-pound torpedoes. It's a spectacular. And I thought just before getting into the questions, if you could all give a sense of just the wonder and diversity that we're talking about that's at risk here. Your best experience.
Well, diving in Northern California is special. We're one of only 5 upwellings in the world. And in addition to being sort of the Serengeti of the sea in terms of species, and that's seabirds, mammals, fish, invertebrates, it's sort of the same reason we're in San Francisco. We're all coming here for the food. We're coming here because there are so many krill, there's so much plankton, there's salmon, there's Dungeness crab. I mean, it is really the cold water that creates this amazing place to go diving and to witness and to harvest. And for me, the colors, you get this indescribable aquatic blue, these tawny golden kelp, cathedral lighting coming through the kelp. Even if you can't see and it's pea green, soup, turbid, nothing, you can look on the blade of a kelp and you can see crabs and purple turban snails. And there's just, anywhere you look, it's almost like you have to readjust your vision to make sure you're not missing things. Because trust me, when you're diving, there's stuff down there that you don't see, and maybe you don't want to see it, but there's so much to see.
Yeah, that is a very beautiful imagery, and it reminds me of the I Spy books, actually, when you described that, because that's totally how it feels when you're in a kelp forest. You can just keep looking, and there's just all these different spatial scales of diversity, and I'm definitely one of those divers that'll go sit and stare at a rock for like the whole dive. I'm happy to do that, but I also, of course, am happy to dive through the cathedrals and these beautiful columns of kelp, and it's just really fun to swim through them. Less fun to swim through a freshly restored kelp forest, I would say. You have lots of little individuals popping up, and they're in a giant kelp forest, where a little distinction between giant kelp and bull kelp. Giant kelp tends to have, when they're really young, they'll grow up and have a single stipe or like a stem. But as they get older and continue to grow, they'll have more stipes. So they'll be kind of like a thick, older growth tree, but lots of little stipes and sticks. And bull kelp just has a single stipe or like a single trunk, if you will. And so a fresh giant kelp forest that's freshly restored or just growing in, because they kind of have those cycles naturally, is super, super tangly. So I definitely have found myself being really frustrated underwater. I'm like, I'm so happy you're here, but you get caught on the kelp and tangled up, and so those are really great moments, but can be a little frustrating to navigate underwater.
I'm not a diver. I am PADI licensed, but I've never been diving here, even though I'm from California. So I don't know what they look like underwater. I've seen a lot of pictures and videos.
They're very photogenic.
Yeah, and you can free dive. There was a whole recreational abalone industry after the commercial industry overfished them. And that's gone away because of this decimation. The fishing community, the tourism community in the 5 northern coastal counties that Jared Huffman represents, having real economic and social impact, and experiential too. I mean, we all, I talk about the advantage of having white sharks. If there's not something bigger and meaner than you are out there, it's not really wilderness. And I grew up with Sea Hunt, Lloyd Bridges playing, underwater investigator. And back then, of course, he was always getting in knife fights underwater, and giant clams would try and grab him. And, you know, kelp are the only thing that really want to drown you. It's a complex, and they're growing a foot a day, so it's like they've taken up a lot of the space there. And now we've lost 95% north of the bay, north of the gate, the Golden Gate. The restoration efforts, the state plans, they seem like a lot of initiative. But when I recently interviewed Brian Tissot, who is the director of the Humboldt State Marine Lab for the last 20 years, he said that he thought it was good, you know, sucking urchins or taking hammers to them. But he didn't believe that we'll really see a return of the urchin until the ocean conditions change. And I wonder how much it feels good to do something, but how much of the state plan that's evolving and the commitments do you think can really impact the state of the kelp? And how much are we waiting for a cooling phase and shifts in the regime, the offshore regime?
Yeah, that's a good question. Climate change it's a big problem, and it's spatially big. It is going to be overshadowing our whole coast, and so it is a huge challenge. It's an uphill battle that we have in protecting and restoring and managing these kelp forest systems. I think one of the most amazing things about what's going on right now in the kelp space is all of the creative solutions, all of the people that are engaged in this and that are trying new things, and people that are working together, and like you were saying earlier, coming together that maybe you would otherwise not think would come together on this problem, and identifying and building and trying lots of different potential solutions. And we're all kind of coming together as a broader community to build in these different layers of tools. We're not going to have one tool or one solution that's going to resolve this challenge. We're going to need lots of different solutions and lots of creativity and layer them in. And I know Francesca and I chatted about this a bit, but I don't know if you want to add to that just in terms of having different solutions.
Yeah, and maybe talk about like what the strategy is in terms of creating refugio coves and how that might impact the larger forests and what have you.
Well, actually, yeah, I kicked that over because you spent a lot of time with the plan.
So it's funny how all these things start to piece themselves together and like things attract. And this year we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of California's hallmark and world-renowned Marine Protected Area Network, the first of its kind in the United States. And it's so important because these places will increase and protect productivity in our marine biodiversity. And I hate to think where we would be if we didn't have those and we were facing this confluence of sort of ecological misfortunes. I think that as we're talking about this, the innovation coming out of companies like Urchinomics, or people thinking about how do we address this and think of it as an opportunity, coupled with let's also take a step back and realize this is a symptom of a larger issue, and should we be voting with our dollars and driving electric cars and doing other things so that we're being climate responsible, not just in terms of our policies, but as our culture, as a state. Because for me, I feel very fortunate that I've been able to see what it is to be in these abundant kelp forests. And as a dive instructor, I've had the privilege of touring people through these locations. And I think when you can capture the imagination and people understand what's at stake, if all of a sudden 95% of the redwood trees were gone, people would be freaking out. And that's exactly what's happening, except it's beneath the surface. And so people have to understand this is symptomatic of something else. And I believe that individuals who come together with the passion and the desire to change things can, and we've seen it already in this short amount of time. There are different ways we can think about, well, do we do outplanting? Do we look at where kelp has been persistent with the help of places like the Bodega Marine Lab and the department scientists and say, do we outplant here? Do we spore? Do we do more targeted removals? I think, I know this is going to sound like I'm repeating, but it really is this concert of all these different things together. It's not just one, it's all that layered approach. And I actually think that of all the things that we have, all the wonderful people who have come to the table to help think about what is a solution, I think that maybe we still don't even have the ultimately strongest impact. Something will come out, some innovation, some collaboration is going to reveal something that's going to have a positive effect, I think, in this whole regime.
I'll add a teeny bit there. What you're talking about with all of these different solutions and different strategies, part of the kelp restoration and management plan that the state is in the, again, early stages of development, so you guys should engage and if you have ideas, come to us, talk to us, implement them. We'll figure out how to test these things. And part of the plan is what we're referring to as a restoration toolkit, which is going to, there's a lot of momentum, a lot of things that are being piloted and tested on these smaller scales to figure out what tools and what options we really have in our arsenal, what's in our tool belt, and where and when those tools might be best applied, and maybe where some of those tools should not be applied, right? And so that's going to be a part of this development of this plan, is actually building a restoration toolkit to kind of solicit and figure out all of these tools that we do have, and maybe developing new ones, especially through collaboration. That's where some of the coolest things have come about. And so yeah, that's sort of part of the plan.
So one way humans interact with nature that we're very good at is eating it. I just wrote a piece, a follow-up piece 20 years later. I wrote a piece 20 years ago, pan-fried to extinction, about white abalone. And now we're just beginning to outsource the white abalone into the surviving kelp in Southern California. There's a big movement in the Caribbean and off of Florida to capture and eat lionfish tacos. Can you give me more details on how you're going to fatten up these zombie urchin and what's great and delicious about them?
So I just want to go back really quickly to what we were talking about earlier, because it plays a part in this. But I think one of the key learnings and really humble moments that we've had over the last few years is all about collaboration, and how we have relied heavily on the scientists that have advised us, and nonprofits that have Greater Fair Lawns, everybody, here's pictures, this is what you need to know, and so I think collaboration in the aquaculture space is an oxymoron. Oftentimes, it's not a transparent industry as it could be, so we're trying to flip that on its head and really be transparent and kind of do things differently in that space. To bring a new term to seafood, or to food in general, which is restorative seafood. So actually trying to make the world a better place. We're not just taking or being sustainable or doing less bad, we're actually trying to fix the problem we have at hand. So with that said, I think what I enjoy and what's so great about uni, as it's known in sort of the sushi space, is the flavor profile. The different species offer different flavor profiles. What you feed them offers different flavor profiles. If you had uni or urchin straight out of the shell and you hated it, it could have been because that urchin had a dead fish, and it tasted like a dead fish. Not so nice. So I think the opportunity to experiment and try different species, try different. Have them in different places, different locations, live, not live, processed. So traditionally, uni in North America is served as a lobe. It's 5 lobes in an urchin. You'll get served a piece of uni on top of your sushi, and that's traditionally how the North Americans have been introduced to the product. We're kind of saying, well, we think it'd be really great if you tried it out of the shell. Can we sit next to oysters in an oyster bar, and the shucker who's doing oysters might shuck a couple varieties of urchins and eat them straight out of the shell? That'd be amazing. And also fresh uni and processed uni is very different too. Processed uni is uni that is used in the sushi market. What they do is they dip the lobes of uni in something called alum, which is a preservative to kind of keep them shelf life longer. We don't anticipate we'll be using alum, but at least for the foreseeable future, we'll be preserving them in something called brine, which is like a salt water, or serving them straight out of the shell. So that's kind of a little background into the kind of eating and food side of uni. I don't know if that answered your question. Did that kind of answer your question? Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
gave me a little bit of salivation.
Okay. It's buttery, salty, and you might hear a term called Umami Rich, which is kind of like a seaweed flavor profile. You can go to Trader Joe's and buy like an umami powder. And that provides sort of a good combination between sweet and salty.
So I have some other questions about predators and the like, but because obviously the more robust the habitat, the better adapted it is to deal with the impacts of climate change. Obviously, at this, when this happened, this cascading disasters of the warm blob, the marine heat wave combined with the virus on the sea stars, used to be in a healthy kelp habitat. You had lots of predators, big lobsters and sea stars and sea otters and the like. We weakened the system to a certain degree. Obviously, as Francesca pointed out, otters aren't interested in zombie urchin, although in Alaska they ate some zombie urchin after they finished off with the Dungeness crab and other critters they could reach. But restoration of, there's talk of if you brought otters into the Bay Area, it could sustain 6,000. I use otters as an example because everybody is like in love with these, voracious marine weasels. But it seems to be we're in a race between restoration and decimation, and how much are we looking at restoration where we still have kelp? I know the outsourcing of the white abalone is a major project. What other efforts is the state and others doing to restore? And you can talk about the MPLA system is doing it all naturally.
Yeah, sure, I can talk about that. Yeah, otters are very charismatic from afar. Got some big teeth on them. So Francesca, early in her intro, was really highlighted a lot of the key efforts that are underway here in California. I'll kind of go south to north, I guess, on some restoration projects that are in progress right now, some of which the state is formally engaged in and some of which are just happening through other organizations. And so in Southern California, there is a giant kelp restoration project that extends across the Palos Verdes Peninsula, and that is being spearheaded by the Bay Foundation. And that's really working in different areas along that peninsula to restore kelp through the removal of purple urchins and working with commercial divers to go through that process. And that's where I experienced that tangly swim through a freshly restored kelp forest. And then kind of working our way up north, we also have in Monterey, Francesca mentioned the pathway for recreational divers to engage in restoration. Tanker Reef is a site. There are boundaries that you can find online, find the coordinates online. And that is an area where recreational divers can go and remove unlimited amounts of purple and red urchin in that boundary. And that work is being monitored in cooperation and collaboration with Reef Check and the Ocean Protection Council and the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And the removal efforts, the recreational removal efforts that Francesca had mentioned with the dive class are being coordinated largely by Giant Kelp Restoration Project, I believe. G2KR. Giant Kelp. Thanks. And so we're working in cooperation with that team to make sure that we're monitoring appropriately with their efforts. And, oh yeah, the video's up and we can jump to that in a second.
Back to eating the problem. Let's see the video.
Hi, my name is Brian Tsuyoshi Takeda, the founder and CEO of Urchinomics. California is essentially the ideal location for us to prove how ecological restoration and commercial development of urchin ranching could actually work hand in hand. The scientists have told us that over 90% of the kelp forest in Northern California has been destroyed by the overgrazing purple urchins.
I'm a researcher here. I've been working on kelp forest issues for the last 20 years, and I was one of the first people to see the loss of the bull kelp on the Northern California coastline.
When I got out to California in the late 1990s, saw those kelp forests, saw how beautiful they were, learned about them as a scientist, and then started to realize that I could bring them back. It's been the leading inspiration of my professional life.
What we would like to do with the purple urchins is to ranch them using our technologies and turn them from an ecological pest into a commercial opportunity and essentially have it served at premium seafood restaurants throughout California. By removing the purple urchins and ranching them, we're not only creating a commercially viable product out of a pest, we're also restoring the kelp forests, which then means we're sequestering carbon. We're also going to be helping marine biodiversity, and we're also going to have all of these other ecological benefits that come with having a vibrant, active kelp forest.
What I hope for is to restore the ocean environment back to its normal state and to bring forth these issues to a broader spectrum of people, because a lot of these marine issues are kind of out of sight, out of mind, and I feel like this involves more people than we know.
Right now, I feel that by supporting urchin ranching, I can play my part and contribute to the future of my kids and the future of everyone else.
Beautiful. And I should also mention that Ana Blanco, who's director of the Ocean Film Festival, and Natasha Benjamin, who's shooting our panel today, are both working on a film on the redwoods of the sea and the crisis we're dealing with. And California is the best place to deal with it. I mean, what I've found is where there's single industry or special interest dominating, coastal seas deteriorate. You know, the fishermen in New England think they own the ocean, so there's no cod off Cape Cod, and the oil industry knows it owns the Gulf of Mexico, and so you have ongoing crisis from oil spills to cancer alleys around it. California is a democracy of blue interest. We have the Navy, we have the ports, we have the fishermen, we have the surfers, we have this sense that everybody has a sense of entitlement to our coasts and oceans. And so confronted with climate disasters, and what's happening to the kelp is largely a climate disaster, there's hope that collaborative efforts, California might lead to some solutions. And I think with that, just solutions come from anywhere. I'd like to open it for questions from anybody here for the panelists. And could, because we're recording it, can we use the microphone on the questions? Identify your person.
Kristen was making a really great list going up the coast, and maybe she could complete that, and then I do have a question.
Are you okay with me? I'll try to be brief.
Yeah, so Kristen's going to give us a list of
and you
efforts.
can ask questions.
Start in San Diego and go to Oregon.
Working our way north. All right, we were in Palos Verdes and then Monterey for the recreational effort, and then another place where that recreational effort is underway is in a place called Casper Cove in Mendocino County. And just to be, could be a little confusing, in Casper Cove, it's unlimited removals of only purple urchin because there is a commercial red fishery in the area, and that's a pretty important site. So just make sure if you do engage that that's purples only at Casper Cove. And that, again, is being monitored in partnership with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Reef Check California. and a lot of the organization and coordination of those efforts on the recreational diver end of things is with Watermen's Alliance, but of course, anyone with a sport fishing license can engage in those activities at those two locations. And then moving a little bit farther north, we have this restoration effort that is in partnership with all of those people and entities I listed earlier, but largely the removal efforts, urchin removal efforts, are being conducted by the commercial divers up based out of the Fort Bragg area. And that effort is, there are 2 sites that project is working on right now, and they're continuing that effort, and I'm saying I'm part of that project, sorry.
Universal Day.
Yeah, the Universal Day. Yes, and so that project is still underway, but we'll be having a report coming out soon about some of those results for that project, which is pretty exciting, so stay tuned.
Anything way up north around Crescent City?
Yeah, sorry, that's the commercial efforts I was talking about. The 2 sites that are underway right now are at Noyo Harbor and Albion Cove. Yes, and then Casper is that recreational effort. Mm-hmm.
And maybe in terms of funding all that, you could. I mean, it's easier from the state than to get federal money, but if you want to talk about Congressman Huffman's Kelp bill.
Yeah.
So before I address the Kelp Act, which is Keep Ecosystems Living and Productive, which is separate from the $2 million earmark that we received. By the way, the Marine Mammal Center also got $500,000 in earmarks, so that's good news. Lots of hope with all these NGOs. Each of these locations, the urchin barrens are affecting the bull kelp in the north and the macrocystis, the giant kelp in the south. And Tom Ford from the Bay Foundation has had success. You saw him in the Urchinomics video. So he actually has been doing restoration work for a while. And that's what gave us hope in our kelp recovery work group, that things were possible. The environmental conditions, the type of species, these are all different, but we know with focus and inclusion from a variety of approaches, something is possible. Congressman Huffman authored a bill called the Kelp Act, where we're hopeful that upwards of $50 million over 4 years will be brought to the West Coast for us to be able to seed and fund and take care of these marine ecosystems that are so important, not just for the enjoyment of recreation and commercial activities, but really make this part of the country what it is. And if you think about the investment in terms of the ocean as an ecosystem service provider, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and all of the tourism endeavors, it's a drop in the bucket, but would go a long way when you think that never before has anything like this been funded in terms of this kelp habitat.
Great, and again, a beginning. Eco-restoration is going to be one of the major human endeavors of this century and beyond, or it has to be if we're going to survive. Other questions?
Questions. So I've been following this story, of course, for many, many years, and I have a couple points. One is I'm very curious why, in introducing the kelp forest, it isn't mentioned right from the start that the sea otter have been gone. That's the second, the redundant top predator. But also, I'm wondering what the state of California, for Kristen, is looking at what's going on in Oregon and how that relationship of looking at the sea otter restoration feasibility study that's been going on up there, whether that might filter into the toolkit, and clearly in only very specific, maybe eelgrass-rich areas, or what that relationship is in terms of coordinating with the sea otter community.
Okay, so the question, just so we get it on the tape, is basically about sea otter restoration and how it's taking place in Oregon and why the sea otters weren't given a high five at the beginning of this effort.
Can I see by a show of hands anybody who is either vegetarian or vegan? A couple folks. Okay. So that's why the sea otters will not work here, because they're vegetarian, vegan. No, I'm just kidding. The best solution for this challenge in the North Coast would be a reintroduction or a boosting of the pycnopodia. The sea stars are what will be the balance. The challenge with the sea otters, which we all love, even though they used to pop my floats in Monterey, they're not going to go and feed on something that doesn't have caloric value. And they have to eat so much in a day to sustain themselves, it's just not feasible. If it was feasible, I'm sure we would be looking at it.
And just to add to that too, is particularly on the North Coast, of course, sea otters were there historically. Said it. It's fact. Not trying to hide that at all or avoid that. But one thing that's really important to think about is that they also really need healthy kelp forests to survive. And that is not what we have on the North Coast. It is truly heartbreaking to see, but there is not a lot of kelp out there. Even though you might have seen some news articles that there's an uptick, some are calling it a resurgence or a surge, but it's really not what it used to be, and that's really important. When you go from 0 to something, that's of course better than nothing, but I just want to make sure that the system is not where it used to be, and it's not where we want it to be moving forward. So. And
as a journalist, I'd just say there was some bad journalism that gave the impression that
flashy
there was this big resurgence, and there's not a big resurgence.
I understand that absolutely.
Can I take another question?
Sure.
You started to talk about the benefits of the kelp forest beyond those of us living on the coast. And as we go into I was thinking about upcoming, the importance of engaging local, state, and federal legislation in this preservation effort, which means engaging local, state, and federal voters. And what is the message that you think is most effective for engaging inland voters and inland legislators in the importance of this work?
How do you engage voters? How do you inform people that this is a crisis in process and why they should care? Let's start with the state official.
All right. I mean, I think some of the imagery that we've talked about with them being analogous to these redwood forests or other types of forests, other systems that are so critical and so beautiful and diverse. I mean, I think imagery that we see in the film festival today is so critical to engage with people who otherwise haven't seen a kelp forest, or even if you live nearby, but for whatever reason, you are not a diver. I mean, diving, to be fair, it's really cold. It's a lot of heavy equipment, and it's a lot of effort to get out there. So, yeah, I think just really sharing as much imagery and talking about how critical and beautiful these systems are is really, I think, going to be a key picture. I'm a scientist, and as much as I hate to say it, photos say more than a graph ever could, and so really imagery, photos, video is going to be really key, I think, to messaging.
And at a policy level, there's a lot of discussion of blue carbon now as ocean as climate solution, and you're looking at things like eelgrass and kelp and mangroves. These all have tremendous absorption of carbon dioxide, and they're all threatened. So not so much for the general public, but at a policy level, as Francesca was saying, the return in terms of keeping these ecosystems that absorb CO2 out of the atmosphere is huge, and it's kind of a race between restoration and decimation.
I also think that something to note is that while you're a scientist and you're in the weeds and dealing with all of it, I think I come from a marketing perspective, and I think it's critical for us to raise awareness around the issue as a whole because it is out of sight, out of mind. So you're a diver, you can see what's going on. But for all of us who don't dive, you can't actually see it without imagery or without the divers showing us and making the correlation with terrestrial forests and so on. So, we've had some media, and I think that, trying to get this situation or this topic and raise awareness to people who perhaps don't have an interest in the ocean, but they see and learn about it anyway. I think that's really important, and I think that's where we all can play a part in educating in a very, simplified way without getting too in the weeds, that this is an issue and this needs to be addressed. And what the scientists have told us is that we're at a tipping point. The spores for the kelp, we're at a tipping point right now, whether those kelp forests can come back or not. I remember having a conversation with a scientist at Bodega Marine Lab by the name of Laura Rogers-Bennett, who's done quite a lot of research over the years with Cynthia Cat and urchins, and she's just like, maybe they'll come back, maybe they won't. We're at a tipping point. There's spores floating in the water, but if there's no kelp for spores to float in the water to then land and grow again, what are we going to do? So it is urgent. Anybody in this film festival has a passion for ocean, but there's a ton of people out there that may have a passion but don't know how to engage, aren't aware, don't know that there's an issue. So I think that's where we can all, play a part and a role in that. Raising awareness is important.
And even though we were told we were good till 2, Anna just gave me the 5-minute sign. So let's do 1 or 2 more questions and then we can follow up.
Thank you so much. I think that was really well said, that you need to look at this more holistically. It starts with a passion for the ocean. But Francesca, you mentioned Pycnopodia. In terms of a holistic sort of approach, urchins aren't the only problem. Is there something being done with Pycnopodia to reintroduce them or to try to build their numbers back up?
I'm less familiar with the efforts. I know there is a sort of work group around reintroducing sea stars. I'm sort of aspirational and hopeful, and I remember seeing the giant sunflower sea stars all the time when I would teach classes and go diving, and so I'm sort of planting my hopeful seed there. But as I was mentioning earlier, it's not going to be just one thing. I'm just saying in terms of the previous question, the interconnectedness, it's sort of like if you remove one thing and then another ecological strange phenomenon happens, you start to see this domino effect. And I believe that if we can collectively bring the urchin removals and allow some areas to restore and plant some more and understand the conditions with persistent kelp canopy and what's happening there, and then try to repeat that, and then reintroduce what was a natural predator that will help the equation, it's a delicate balance. I'll see if Kristen can speak to more specifically what's happening around that Sea Star effort, but there are definitely things underway.
Yeah, thank you. Just a little bit about that. So I forgot to mention this earlier, but the state of California partnered with, so the Ocean Protection Council and California Sea Grant funded a ton of new research projects and one of which that are focused on understanding kelp restoration and recovery and resilience. And one of those projects includes some work that's exploring the role of Pycnopodia and how many urchins do they eat in a day. These are things we don't know yet and are going to be really critical to understanding if and when it's appropriate to reintroduce them and what role they're playing in terms of facilitating that system and where you are in your recovery process. Because maybe there were questions about otters where we know that they're good at maintaining existing forests, but like I talked about, they really need that healthy kelp forest to survive. And so it's not doing them any good, it's not gonna do us any good to put them in a system where you don't have kelp. Maybe Pycnopodia isn't in that same boat, but we don't know how many urchins they eat a day. Will they eat urchins that are barren or if they're fat and happy? Like, these are things that we're still understanding, and so those are going to be some results that'll come out of the work that was funded by the state. So stay tuned for that. Yeah.
You were going to say something?
No, I'm going to comment on they might not eat the urchins anyway. There's no roe in them.
So we don't know if these sea stars are really the rock stars of the
But
habitat.
they might, because I've seen them called ferocious predators of the sea, which gives me a little chuckle every time I hear it. But they move relatively quickly for a sea star. So
they're scary if you're
scary,
an
yeah.
urchin. One more question, final question. Anybody have one?
Yeah, this is just for Denise. What do you feed the urchins?
Very good question. So we created, we actually took a feed that was made for urchins in Norway that was 20 years in development and had never really been used. So we took the formulation of that and have fine-tuned it. So there was traditionally in it some animal byproduct, fish meal and that kind of thing, and we've removed all that. And basically the majority of this pellet, which looks kind of like a shoehorn, is made of Japanese kombu. So that is basically a food-grade seaweed that is grown sustainably in Asia that is used for the sushi market. So we take the offcuts of that kombu that's already being used for the sushi market, and then that's formulated into a feed. What's unusual and different about this feed, and that's very hard to copy, is that it doesn't melt quickly in the water. So that is in the processing of these pellets, the technology around the processing that allows the urchin to slowly feed over the pellets over a period of time. So it's vegan, GMO free, there's no scary ingredients in it, it's nothing like that. So yeah.
So if people want to learn more, do you have a website or email? Why don't you all just give what you can?
So if you ever want to know what's going on from the sanctuary side, you can go to farallones.org. That's FARALLONES.org. And all of the restoration projects we're working on, but in particular the Kelp project, are listed there.
I would say a very good go-to first resource that has a nice overview of the state's kelp and their management approach and a little bit about restoration efforts underway would be the Enhanced Status Report, which is on the department's Marine Species Portal. And so I don't have the link off the top of my head, but if you Google that, you should be fine. And if you have questions, you can email me and my team at kelp@wildlife.ca.gov. So we'd be happy to answer questions if you guys have them later as you're thinking about kelp.
Urchinomics.com. Very easy. And I'm Denise, and I can be emailed if there's any additional questions at dm@urchinomics.com. And we also have a great Instagram account that provides a lot of we're doing trials all over the world. We're commercial in Japan at the moment, so you can kind of see what's going on in other places. And yeah, it's a nice kind of visual resource for you all.
And again, the kelp forest, like the ocean as a whole, really is just too amazing, sacred, fun, and vital for our survival to lose. So we work to make sure it's not lost. And I want to thank these 3 women who are on the cutting edge of working to protect and restore. Thank you.
Thank you.